thank you folks for coming. I appreciate you coming on such a beautiful day and when we have other things going on in Groveland. But we have a fantastic speaker today, Michael Tougias, who's written 20 books and has brought them all here in case you haven't gotten to read some of them. But he has Fatal Forecast, and he was here a couple of years ago for Groveland Gathers to Read, oh yes, there's the King Philip's War and the Blizzard of '78, and a whole bunch of other wonderful books that you might want to take a look at after. And I also wanted to mention a couple of other events coming up. One on October 28th, we're going to be having the Graveyard Girls. It's a Monday, and that will be at 6 o'clock. And we hope to have it also here in Town Hall. And that will be for an hour and a half, and that should be fun. We have had them here before, but they will be updating their presentation, and I think bringing some of their kind of graveyard jewelry too.
So it won't be the same program they did before?
It won't be the same program. We'll have new things. So, and we also have another reading group that we're trying to get kicked off. It's at River Pines, and they are going to be doing Edgar Allan Poe, short stories, and that is on October 30th. So if you'd like to read some Edgar Allan Poe and discuss, they'll be discussing at 2 o'clock on Wednesday, October 30th. And now I'd like to introduce you to Michael Tougias, award-winning author and lecturer. And thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you all for coming. The program you're going to see takes place in May of 2007. And one of the reasons for the title, A Storm Too Soon, is that these sailors were attempting to go from Florida to France, and they wanted to be ahead of hurricane season, so they left in May, and as you can imagine, they still get hit by a hurricane, and that's part of the reason for the title. And when I approached Simon & Schuster to do the book, I said, and I want to do this book in the present tense, and they were like, oh, no, you know, only 1% of books are written in the present tense, they're all in the past tense. So I said fine, and then I ignored their advice and wrote the whole book in the present tense, and they're like, oh, we love this, and you know, so, and it made me think, why aren't more books written in the present tense, especially books with a lot of action, because it makes you feel like you're there. And so I think future projects I'll probably do in the present tense, because the feedback I get is, you know, I read it in 2 nights, and I intended it to be very fast-paced. But I also say to those readers who comment, did you notice anything unusual about the book? And they don't. And they go present tense, and they go, oh, yeah, that's it. So I think for me, that's something I'll stay with. And as far as new projects go, I have a sign-up sheet. I do a newsletter every 6 months, so if you're interested. And I've got one book that's similar to these. You might have heard how the Bounty sank in Hurricane Sandy, the recreation of the Bounty. I've got that book coming out in April, but a very different book as well about a student from the north of Boston area who his senior year came down with cancer, and he left this incredibly moving journal the last year of his life, 365 days. And a teacher gave it to me and said, you got to read this. And I read it and was so moved. His writing was great. His insights were great. That I approached his parents. The book is called Derek's Gift. Derek died after that year of battle. But I said, what if we published the journal and then I pick up in part 2 of the book what happens to the 5 key people in his life that he had such an impact on, and they were with him through thick and thin because there were some surprising twists and turns. And so that's what the book is. You read his journal, then all of a sudden after his death, you follow the lives of these people and how he impacted and changed the course of their lives. So it's a little bit of a departure for me, but you can't always write disaster books. You need, I did one book that's totally out of character. Where is it? There's a porcupine in my outhouse. So I don't just write about serious things. This is about my cabin in Vermont, where I tried to live like a mountain man and failed miserably many years ago. So that's what I put in the newsletter, things like that. And so with this program, what I do is let the slides tell the story, and I give you the research behind the scenes. So you're kind of going through the event the same as these three sailors. And the one difference between the book and the slide program is the book, it follows 4 boats clobbered by this storm. And in the slide program, I'm going to primarily focus on the main vessel. And that's this one here called the Sean Samore II. Yeah, you can get in those, thank you. And this was a 45-foot sailboat. And one of the reasons I picked this particular story is I look for a story that has a lot of twists and turns and interesting characters, colorful characters. And the captain of this vessel, Jean-Pierre Deletz, met that criteria. He was a dual citizen of the U.S. and France. And on this journey, what he was doing, he was about to retire in France and wanted to take his sailboat, which was down in Florida, across the ocean. And I do get into his background a little bit. He had really a horrific childhood, and I get into that. And the reason I do is it made him somewhat of a loner and a very creative and independent thinker, all of which come in handy during this survival ordeal. So he puts an ad in an online journal saying he wants to take his boat across the ocean, but he's looking for a couple of people to join him and help. And so 62-year-old Rudy Snell from Ottawa, Canada, signs up. And then a much younger man, 33-year-old Ben Ty from Great Britain. So you've got this, international crew, total strangers are going to be on this confined space of a boat for, a pretty difficult journey to take a small boat across the Atlantic. And their plan is to ride the Gulf Stream to the northeast and then hook around Bermuda. And JP's got all the latest safety equipment on board. He downloads every bit of weather information he can, and he sees there's a window coming up of good weather. So they picked, I think it was May 4th that they left. But weather forecasts don't go as planned, and this is what they're looking at 3 days into the voyage. Problem is they're way out at sea by now. They're already over 200 miles off the coast. So this freak storm, it's not like they can just duck into a port. And there's no one to blame for this storm. In my book, Fatal Forecast, I put the blame on the National Weather Service because their weather buoys were malfunctioning. But in this case, it was just a freak storm, and I'll show you why in a couple of slides. So they're in this sudden storm, and they just got to ride it out. Like the Gulf Stream is kind of like a character in the story almost, and I made myself a Gulf Stream expert. I knew that it flowed along the eastern seaboard, and where it's dark orange, it's the warmest. And I also knew it's a dangerous place during a storm because if the flow is going to the northeast and the winds are coming out of the northeast, that's generating waves that collide against the current, and it makes them steeper. So you could be, 20 miles outside the Gulf Stream and have 20-foot waves and be in it, and the waves could potentially be double that size. But I also learned it has these cold water and warm water eddies curling off it. and they can spin off and detach from it, and they're almost as dangerous as the Gulf Stream because of the current. And you never know where these are going to be. The Gulf Stream meanders a little bit, but these warm water and cold water eddies form and disappear and spin off at all different locations. The storm that hit them it was a hurricane, but because it wasn't hurricane season, it was just simply called Tropical Storm Andrea, and became quite large. But unlike most hurricanes, they'll generate off Africa, say, and then as they come across the Atlantic and hit the warmer waters of the Caribbean, they really gain strength. This storm is just the opposite. Its genesis is off the Carolinas at the top of the arrows, and then it goes in the opposite direction of most hurricanes, heads in this zigzag pattern. And that's one of the reasons that it was so hard to predict, and also that it blew up so suddenly. Meteorologists called it a bombogenesis. In other words, its genesis was like a bomb. So its strongest point was way back at the beginning. And the numbers there stand for the days in May, and 7 is roughly the location, May 7th. It's also the location of JP, Ben, and Rudy. So as you can see, they're far out to sea and directly in the path of this storm. JP's wife, Mikey, had a real bad feeling before he left on the trip. And I said to her, well, that's because he's going across the Atlantic. And she said, no, I dropped him off at the airport, and I started to get the bad feeling. He'd done that trip before. He'd even done it single-handedly. She said, I couldn't put my finger on it, and she said, and then I had this vision. I said, you mean a dream? And she goes, no, a vision, put it in the book the way I'm telling you. She said that she was on her daily walk, was sitting on a hillside when everything went black, and then she said there were flickering lights and then water pouring in. And she said it lasted about 10 to 15 seconds, and she thought it was the inside of a boat, so she ran back to the house to call JP and tell him to postpone the trip, but he had left 12 hours earlier. So whatever happened to her, it was something unusual, but she couldn't stop him, and he's already in the storm a couple days later. And this is what it looked like through the pilot house, these giant waves coming at them, and they're trying to keep their bow into the seas like this vessel. They don't have any sails up, but they do have a motor, but eventually the waves get so big they overwhelm the motor, so he just decides, shut the motor down and just, we're gonna get below where it's safer so we don't get swept off the deck, and seal the boat up. And so they change course. They let the wind push them back to the southwest. So there's the first part of their journey, and then when the waves are too powerful, they're drifting backwards. But the boat's holding up pretty good. You know, they're sealed in tight underneath in the cabin. So there's the Sean Samore up at the top of the screen, but there were two other vessels nearby, and one of those, the Flying Colors, you might recognize the name because in the Providence Journal it was on the front page for 3 days because they too were in the storm. And I followed their progress up until that crew set off their emergency beacon. But then I don't really speculate about that boat because, whoops, what did I hit? Because the boat disappears without a trace, and these were the 4 crew members on board, relatively young, and not a single seat cushion was ever found. And the 2 males were very experienced too. They both had their captain's license. And I thought to myself as I was writing the book, boy, their parents probably still live in Rhode Island. I don't want them to be blindsided by this book coming out. But I also didn't want to pick up the phone and call them because it's such a painful thing to bring up. But looking back, I'm so glad I forced myself to call their parents and tell them because they really appreciated not getting surprised by the book, and then two of them I became friends with, and they just had a million questions based on the research, because all they knew was this terrible storm came, and not a piece of the boat was ever found. And there was another vessel that I thought would be fine because it was inshore and they could actually drop anchor, but the winds were so strong it blew them towards the Diamond Shoals that you see in this photo, and that would have been catastrophe. So they set off their emergency beacons. So in the course of the early morning hours of May 7th, we've got 4 emergency beacons from these 4 vessels all going off. Elizabeth City is the nearest Coast Guard air station, and to have 4 beacons go off, in the same period is almost unheard of. So they're somewhat overwhelmed at Elizabeth City of what's going on. And JP's troubles happened actually the first of the 4 at 2 a.m. And that's when a giant wave hit the boat, and the wave broke, similar to this photo, broke right on the vessel, put the vessel on its side, comes down off the wave, and then the following surge completely capsized the boat. And this is the inside of JP's boat. So the ceiling's on the ground, so they're on the ceiling, and this tabletop came off, lands right on JP and breaks ribs on his right-hand side. Then water pours in, and he can't get the tabletop off him. He's shouting for Ben to help him because Ben was standing right by him and the boat capsized. But here's Ben. Ben didn't respond because he was hurled from one bulkhead into the other and happened to hit it right where they had a little TV mounted on the wall and shattered the TV, so he's stunned. But Rudy, the Canadian, with the gray beard, he was okay. He hears JP in the darkness, the lights were flickering, kind of like Mikey's vision. Water's pouring in. He gets the table off JP, and the boat rights itself. And the first thing JP does is he knows the vessel's compromised, is he activates their emergency beacon. And here's where the story, remember I said I like stories with a lot of twists and turns. Here's where the story gets interesting. He's got 2 emergency beacons on board. One is an old EPIRB. The other one is a new GPIRB. The G is for global positioning. And the old EPIRB gets washed off the boat, and they figure that's not going to work. JP activates the brand new GPIRB, but the manufacturer messed up and gave 2 different units the same serial number. So when the Coast Guard eventually gets the signal that this thing's going off, they go by the latest registration, and that's to a boat in Alabama. They got the same serial number as JP's. So they call this guy in Alabama, and he says, I'm in bed, my boat's fine down at the dock. And the Coast Guard says, well, your GPIRB is malfunctioning. It says you're in the Atlantic. Go disable the unit. And he does, and then the Coast Guard goes back to their normal work, figuring we solved that problem. Meanwhile, JP is thinking, at least the Coast Guard knows what's happening to us out here. And what ended up happening was, the other problem with that brand new unit was it only, from JP's perspective, it only was blinking, showing that it's activated for 45 minutes. It should last 10, 12 hours. He doesn't know why that. And so now, when he sees that, he knows maybe the Coast Guard is not coming. But the old unit that got washed off the boat, even though it was 11, 12 years old, did go off after about 45, 50 minutes. And the Coast Guard did get that signal. But it was registered to an old vessel of JP's with old contact information. So, the ghost. So the Coast Guard's really confused. They've got 2 Atlantic EPIRBs going off. One they already determined was malfunctioning, and now this one who they can't seem to get any of the contacts. but they start working their way through the list. And then disaster happens, the boat gets hit by an even bigger wave. I said to the Coast Guard, what does a really big breaking sea look like? And they sent me this photo where they do some of their training at the Columbia Bar. And watch what happens to this. This is their 47-foot motor lifeboat.
Yeah.
It just stands it right up. And this is just what happened to JP's vessel. And then the following surge completely rolls it over. And in JP's case, when the vessel rolled and it's capsized, they're all waiting for it to come back up, you know, right itself like it did the first time. And after waiting for a couple minutes, nothing happens. And JP shouts, I gotta get the life raft, it's our only hope. And so to get out of the boat, which is filling with water, he swims down to find the companionway stairs. And as he gets out of the vessel, wouldn't you know it, that's the time period the boat decides to right itself. Only he's in the ocean.
Yeah.
So he just hangs on. I don't know what he hung on to, but hung on to something. And by luck, when the boat came up around, it flipped him right into the cockpit. the safest place he could have ended up. And I like to say, here he is in the cockpit, and he's not wet, and his hat never came off. But in the storm, you could imagine it was a different scene. It was nighttime, giant waves crashing on the boat. He looks for the life raft, which is supposed to be mounted on the stern, and there's nothing there. You know, he's just like, oh, we're dead. The boat's sinking. Then he notices, here's the stern of the boat, here's the bow, you know, the mast in the middle. He noticed the mast is cracked at an angle, come back towards the stern, and where the spreader part is on top of the inflated life raft, trapping it. So he gets under the mast, there's a little, about this much room, and like doing like a push-up, picks it up a little bit. So say I'm JP doing the push-up, then he uses his leg and he kicks the raft out as best he can from the mast, and it budges a little bit. Then a wave hits the vessel and boom, down comes the mast on his back, and it breaks ribs on his other side. And he's just in excruciating pain. But you can imagine, you know, the adrenaline, the alarm bells, this is it. So again, there's a little bit of moonlight coming through every now and then. He sees that the only thing still trapping the life raft is the spreader is impaled in the canopy, which is inflated. So he starts ripping the canopy off. He doesn't want to do that, but he's got no choice, you know, to get the life raft free. So I'm skipping some things obviously, but after a period of time and much pain, he does get the canopy free, secures the raft that's free from the mast now, runs below. Rudy says, did you get the raft? And JP says, yes. And Ben says, let's go. And then JP makes a critical decision. He pauses and he goes, no, not yet. We're going to wait for the water to hit such and such a level inside the boat. Basically, he's trying to buy more time, knowing how dangerous it is outside. And that's really hard to do, stay inside, kind of entombed as the water's rising. But they do. And it probably buys them maybe another 45 minutes to an hour of time, but then it hits that level and JP goes, it's time, let's go. Rudy has stuffed his pockets full of apples, oranges, water. He put in a steak knife and flares. And they don't have survival suits on, by the way. The survival suits were on the boat, but they were right underneath where the first part of the mast cracked, and they couldn't get at the locker there. And so they get at the boat into the cockpit, and so the life raft wouldn't look like this because the red part would be gone, but the two black rings are there. I call it not a life raft, but a kid's pool. You know, because it's got two inflated rings and it's filled with water. And so you know, these life raft advertisements always make it look so easy to board a life raft, but trust me, I've interviewed enough people in storms and they say it's tough as hell. In fact, in the story I'm doing about the Bounty, the reason they can't get into the life raft is they did have survival suits on, but they leaked a little bit coming, you know, probably from the neck area. And the water goes down into the legs and they can't lift their legs, so they can't get in the life raft. It's just unbelievable. But in JP, Ben, and Rudy's case, all they have to do is jump because there's no canopy. It's not, you know, time it through the opening. And then they push off away from the vessel and they go about 5 feet and then the raft goes right back into the vessel. And they realize they forgot to untie the line, but Rudy's got that steak knife, so he cuts the line, holds the line up, holds the knife up for JP to see, and JP shouts, "Chuck it, we don't want anything sharp in the boat." And then they push off, and the raft doesn't move, and they realize there's 2 more lines tangled in the ballast bags that hang under the raft for stability, going back to the boat, and he's just thrown a knife overboard. And there's always, in these stories, yes, decision-making plays a big role, but there's always elements of luck and bad luck. Rudy can't believe how many bad things are happening, and then Ben taps him on the shoulder, and Rudy turns around, and Ben holds up a tiny jackknife that he bought one day before the trip, just on a whim. And that's what they used to cut the lines. And they said a couple waves came between them and the vessel, and then they saw the boat sink right before their eyes. It went down bow first. And so they basically got off the boat with 5 minutes to spare. That's how close Jason timed it with that water line. So now they're just taken away by the storm, and this was a photo taken during the storm from an aircraft, and it's hard for you to see how big that wave is. The top is cresting, but in this photo is the life raft with Ben, Rudy, and JP. It's right, that smudge right there, like the size of a quarter, and that gives you the scope of the waves. The waves were measured by the aircraft radar altimeter as being 80 feet. And I've never heard of that. I've heard of a rogue wave being 80 feet, but not sustained waves, and it's because of the Gulf Stream. So you can imagine what it was like for these guys just to be tossed around. Now, as a writer, this was an interesting part of the story. There's Rudy and JP. In the beginning of the book, most of it's following JP because he's making most of the decisions. He's the captain. Well, now he's in the life raft and he's unconscious. And a lot of the focus goes to Rudy because Rudy's making more of the decisions. And when the life raft flips, JP just drifts away. He's got a life preserver on. And Rudy's the stronger swimmer between him and Ben, and Rudy goes and gets him. And that happens 3 more times. The life raft flips, they're all in the water, they're trying to right it, and they have to get JP. So it was interesting to write about this shift in the focus. And they do not think help is coming. They can't think that any aircraft could possibly fly. But there is a Coast Guard cutter, and the captain took this picture, and he said, we weren't even in the real storm, and the waves were huge. And I said, so if you weren't in the storm, how long would it take you to get to the emergency scene? And he said, 10 to 12 hours. I said, well, they were going to be dead. There's no way, either drowning or hypothermia. And he said, I know, but we tried. He said, we took a terrible beating. And the other thing the Coast Guard did, remember, so they eventually got that old EPIRB and figured something's going on out there. And then the other vessels started to activate theirs. The workhorse for the Coast Guard that often gets overlooked is a C-130, a converted transport plane that's used for search and rescue. They fly out to where JP's old beacon went off, and they fly right over the raft, and they don't see it. The waves are too big. Rudy realizes that, and he waits for it to come around again, and this time he's ready with his flares. He fires the first one, and it's a dud. He can't believe it. Grabs the second one, pulls the firing mechanism. It's a dud. And now he's down to his third flare, and the plane is leaving, and he fires that. The third one is a dud, and he just can't believe his luck, and he starts to lower his arm, and it goes off, but it goes off at an angle. He's not holding it like this, he's holding it like this, and it goes right into a wave. And there's always 7 people on the C-130, and only one of the 7 thought he saw something, and a good thing that person convinced the captain to turn around. And so when they came back, this time they did see the raft, and it was interesting, on the radio transcript, they say, see a raft with 2 people on board. And I'm like, why did they say 2 people? And I asked, and they said later, well, one of the people we never saw because his foul weather gear was a dark color. And I knew they meant Ben, because Ben's foul weather gear was red, Rudy and JP's was a bright yellow, and they could pick out the 2 yellow and not the dark red. And so I looked at my own life vest that I use out in the ocean, and it's a dark green. They're never going to pick it out. And I began to think they shouldn't even sell life vests that aren't a neon type of color. So I need to replace my life vest. But they dropped some rafts to try and help them, because the raft they're in is really in bad shape, but the wind just blows them miles away. So they're doing figure 8s over the raft, and Rudy thinks they're just on a death watch. We only have a couple hours to live, and they can't do anything, extract us. He doesn't think a helicopter could fly into the storm. But back at Elizabeth City, they tell a commanding pilot, it's your discretion how close to get, but give it a shot. And so the thing that makes this Storm Too Soon book a little different from the others is fully half the book focuses on these 4 rescuers, because they get in trouble. So I'll introduce you to them. That's Drew Dazzo kneeling down. He's the rescue swimmer. Scott Higgins, he's the one who's going to operate the cable, the hoist. And the tall one is Nevada Smith. He's the commanding officer. And then Aaron Nelson is the co-pilot. And it was interesting. The first person I contacted when I thought this could be an interesting story to investigate was Nevada. And I said, so what's it like flying into a hurricane? And he surprised me. He goes, I wouldn't know. I'm like, what do you mean? You're the commanding officer. And he said, I wasn't flying. And I was like, really? Why? And he just said, Aaron is the better pilot. So he gave up controls knowing they're going into something none of them had ever flown into before, a hurricane. And I thought that was a great kind of leadership move to suppress your ego and give up the controls to somebody you think could do it better. Because Aaron had flown Blackhawks as well as these big, this is what they call a Jayhawk, similar. So off they go, and when they get on scene, they can't see the life raft. And the C-130 is trying to tell them, 2 o'clock off your nose. And Nevada goes, I can't see it. And they go, get lower. And Nevada goes, we can't get lower. The waves are 80 feet. You've never seen anything like it. And what happens is, you've got these big troughs in between the waves, 2 waves top here. Aaron got it down just a little bit, maybe 10 feet low in the trough, and that's how they saw the life raft. And on the radio, Nevada just goes, holy. And then he says to Drew over the headset, he's the rescue swimmer, what do you think? And rescue swimmers are crazy, or maybe that's the wrong word, gung-ho. And Drew goes, absolutely, I want to try. They go, okay. So the story shifts focus to to Drew, and so he'd come down on that cable from the arm, and Scott would have Scott would have the pendant that can raise and lower it in one hand, and in the other hand a glove that he can help move the cable. And they put Drew out of the aircraft. I did this program once with Scott, and I always learn something new with these people. And Scott said, when Drew first went out, I had lowered about 10 feet of line, and he disappeared. And so Scott is hanging out the doorway, and he looks aft, and he said, you wouldn't believe it, there's Drew sitting on the external fuel tank. The wind had blown him to the rear of the aircraft, and he's right on the fuel tank. And then he said Drew pushed off it, and Scott started releasing line, and Drew went all 100 feet down and unclipped. He's got a harness, he's wearing a harness that goes under your legs, and the clip is here, unclips, and then swims to the life raft. And the helicopter pulls up away from the wave tops. And Rudy and Ben are watching this. JP's unconscious. And when Drew gets to the raft, he spits out the snorkel, and he's got, an arm hanging on. And then he goes to Ben and Rudy, he goes, how you guys doing? And Rudy says, you guys are effing amazing. I can't believe anybody came. I can't believe anybody came. And Drew gets down to business. Okay, calm down. Who's hurt? And they point to JP, and they grab and push JP out. And Drew, by this time, Scott back up in the cabin has brought the cable back up, attached the basket. It's not a litter. It's a small basket you get in crouch. Lowers that, and it's near the raft. Drew will swim that person to the basket and stuff them in it. And so JP is coming up. Now, JP, before he went unconscious, he thought he was dying, and when he's coming up, he was dying. When he's coming up, the rotors kind of rouse him, the roar, and so he thinks he's in the afterlife. And he just has a weird sensation that he's swinging and floating. And then when he gets to the cabin door, his eyes aren't even open yet. He's not totally with it. Scott gets him out of the basket and pushes him up against a wall in a sitting position. And the next photo is amazing because it was taken just 5 seconds after JP opens his eyes for the first time in 3 hours. And he still thinks he's in the afterlife. He doesn't know where he is and what's happening. And Nevada realizes JP's in shock, so he blasts the heater, trying to warm him up. JP's also big time hypothermic. I always forget to mention this, but it's an important thing. Water temperature was 70 degrees, and that sounds warm, but water sucks away your body temperature much faster than air. So JP had been in the water the longest. He was very hypothermic. So the next one that Drew, I didn't know this either, that the life raft is a big target for the wind and the waves, and that drifts very far away. So Drew is a small target, so he doesn't drift as fast. So they've got to pick up Drew, reposition the aircraft, find the life raft, and put him down for the next rescue. And the next one up is Rudy. He gets him in the basket without incident, and Scott told me when he brought Rudy up, Scott shouts, "Get out of the basket," because fuel now is a big issue, and Rudy makes no move. And Scott thinks, oh my God, this guy with the gray beard has had a heart attack. And I got my rescue swimmer down there all alone, not even on the hook. And so in this next photo, he's just yanked Rudy out of the basket. And he's trying to get him in a sitting position. But what I thought was interesting in this photo is, look at JP, he's coming around, he's reaching out and tapping Rudy on the shoulder and saying, is it really you? Are you alive? Are you alive? And they now have, Rudy did not have a heart attack, he was just so hypothermic, he couldn't move. They've got one person to save, and that's Ben. And poor Ben, the life raft drifted far away. Ben thinks the helicopter is left because of some fuel issue or whatever, or even crashed, even worse. So he's alone in the life raft, and that had to be a terrible feeling. But they pick up Drew, and to save time, they do something called an air taxi. They don't bring Drew back up to the aircraft and reposition over the life raft. They skim Drew over the waves to save time, and then Drew just flips off and falls. And Ben is so happy when he sees Drew coming, and there's Drew coming to Ben. Ben's got the shaved head. There's what's left of the life raft. And then Ben looks in horror as Drew pulls out a big knife, and Drew stabs the life raft to sink it because he doesn't want any other Coast Guard people to risk their lives at an empty life raft. And Ben thinks that's a really dumb idea because the life raft has kept him alive, and now Drew's just stabbed him. What if they can't get up? So he doesn't like that, but in this photo, the life raft is already sinking. And Drew takes Ben, stuffs him into the basket, and Scott wheels him right up. And that's Ben entering the aircraft, and JP's coming around, patting him on the head. So is Rudy. Looks like Ben's in shock, but he was in pretty good shape. He was younger and bigger, and both healthy with hypothermia. So this is the part of the book where my father said, I'll bet you're making this stuff up. Because everything that you can imagine could go wrong starts to go wrong. They got the survivors up, but they don't have Drew, who's down in the water. And Aaron said one big old wave came and picked Drew up so high that he was almost at nose level with the helicopter. And on the radio transcript, you hear Aaron just talk to himself and says, oh my God, I can see Drew's face. You can never see a rescue swimmer's face. And Aaron told me then Drew fell off the wave and disappeared. And then it's just on the transcript, Nevada saying, where is he, where is he? And Aaron talking to himself, hold, hold. And Scott in the background just going, what do you mean you can't find him? They cannot find him. And Aaron said it was the longest 2 minutes of his life. And he said then Drew popped up and he did something he'd never seen a rescue swimmer do. He gave the emergency signal that he, Drew, was drowning. And Scott, he just can't believe this because he can't use the basket now because the wind, you know, before he'd put the basket down and Drew could swim to the basket. Now Drew can't swim, he's drowning. He's disappearing under waves. Sometimes he comes up, sometimes he doesn't. He'll appear somewhere else. And so he's got to use the hook. And again, skipping some things, eventually, through part skill, part luck, the hook hits Drew. He's got the presence of mind to slip it through this ring. But he doesn't have the strength to hold the cable like he's supposed to. He should come up in the sitting position because the harness goes underneath his thighs. He just is like this. And Scott said when the wave fell out from under Drew and he's on the cable, he said it jerked him like this. And Scott said the whole helicopter shuddered and went down 2 feet. And on the tape, Scott says, I think I just broke his back. And Nevada's shouting, get him up, get him up. And then, again, you wouldn't think more bad stuff can happen. Scott says, so I'm bringing him up. I think I've broken his back, and all of a sudden the cable slices through my big leather glove. I'm like, what's that mean? He said the cable was frayed in this spot. I said, you mean the cable's going to break? And he goes, I didn't think it was going to break, but because it was frayed, I'm worried it's going to get stuck in the hoist. We're going to have Drew halfway up just dangling, and there's nothing we can do. I'm like, so what do you do? And he said, just pray. So he slowed the lift down a little bit and just watched it, and it went through the mechanism okay. And then as fast as he could, he brought him up and pulled Drew into the plane head first, and he was on his back. And And Ben tells the rest of the story, because as you can see, Ben was situated right next to the door, so he had a bird's eye view of this drama of what was happening to Drew. And Ben said he really did think Drew had broken his back, but he didn't. And he said after a couple of minutes, he said Drew rolled over onto his knees and then looked at me being Ben, and said, "Are you okay?" And what's happened is Drew's training is kicking in, because he's the aircraft's EMT, and he's supposed to check on each survivor. So Scott just screams at Drew, "You're back, forget about them, get back down." And then you wouldn't think there's any humor in this story at a time like this, but Ben later told me, he said, "I knew after about 10 minutes that Drew was going to be okay." And I said, "How?" And he said, "Well, he was sitting up, and I could tell he was going to be sick, but he had the presence of mind not to stink up the aircraft." And he said, all of a sudden he takes off his flipper, pukes in his flipper, the door is shut, but there's a little opening in it, and he slides the little opening and throws the whole mess out. And Ben said if he had the presence of mind to be thinking that way, he knew he was going to make it. And he had suffered some back issues, but nothing permanent. And by now, the cabin's sealed, Nevada has taken over the controls, and this is what it looked like flying back, just wave after giant wave. No, you really couldn't make out the horizon. They're going through the emergency procedures if they don't have enough gas to get to Elizabeth City, and they have to touch down on a beach, what they're going to do. And they end up making it to Elizabeth City, where it's a bright, sunny day. And so the coasties at Elizabeth City, they rush out to help, and they can't believe the injuries, that 3 people are injured. And they give Nevada a hard time, going, "How could you injure 3 people in one rescue, including your rescue swimmer?" And Nevada says, "The waves are 80 feet. And they just go, "Yeah, right, Nevada." They don't believe them. And this photo, there's JP being helped off. Rudy's already in the stretcher. Nevada's not in this picture. I think he's off to the side. Yeah, because that's Drew there in the back. And Nevada's got the headset on, and he hears other EPIRBs, radio chatter about other EPIRBs going off, and he turns to Aaron and he goes, "Get ready, we may have to go out again." And Aaron just looks at him and goes, "Not with me, you're not." He didn't care who the commanding officer was. And Aaron's wife said it best. She said when he got home, she asked him what was wrong, and he said, "I'll tell you later." She said he took 2 steps, just lied down on the kitchen tiles, and didn't move for 6 hours. Wasn't even asleep, just was so emotionally spent. And remember I said the coasties didn't believe him about the waves, so Scott says, "Well, maybe you guys can use the aircraft, but replace the cable, it's frayed." And the mechanics come back in and they tell Scott, "We looked at it, it's fine." Scott goes, "No, it's not." And they go, "Yes, it is." And Scott goes, "How much did you look at?" And they said, "The usual, the first 50 feet. Scott said, "Pull the whole thing out." And sure enough, at the 110-foot mark, it was a mess. And that's when the coasties started to think, maybe they really did have 80-foot waves to let out that much cable. And then later, these photos that you've been seeing, like I'll go back one, Nevada says, "I even took some video," and then he shows the rest of the station a video, and they believe him of what just transpired in the last 5 hours. And so on my website, you could see some of the video that these still images were taken from. It's funny, Nevada actually got in trouble for taking some video, but now the Coast Guard's videos their rescue with a mounted camera, so they do it anyways. There is a happy ending to the story. Rudy's a Canadian, Drew's an American, and in Canada they have their highest peacetime award. It's called the Star of Courage, and they bent their rules and gave it to an American for the first time, and the 2 men became friends. And what part of the book is about is these three strangers, Ben, Rudy, and JP, coming together. And if they didn't work together, and each one make a critical move at a certain time, none of them would have made it. So it was, how people can work together to pull off the impossible and the power of friendship. And when you put your mind to something, what you can do. And because Rudy said, I thought for sure we were going to die, but I was going to go down fighting. And I thought that was a good way to look at it. And then I asked JP, how has this event changed your life? And he said, no major changes, but he said, I no longer wear a watch. And the way he explained it was, I don't want to follow time anymore. Time's just a man creation. I want to live by the day and enjoy each day and have gratitude for each day. And that's the theme I hear from the survivors. They have this new sense of gratitude that too many of us take advantage of. And then JP really surprised me 2 weeks ago. He sent me an email and said, I sold my new sailboat and bought an RV. I was shocked because he was a lifelong sailor. So I guess it had an impact with him in some other ways as well. Thank you very much. Questions or comments? I answered one question I always get. Was JP still sailing? And he was staying closer to shore, but the RV really surprised
Well,
me.
maybe his wife had something to do
Yeah,
with
she
that.
probably did. So he said, can I register it to your home address in Plymouth? I said, absolutely. So he's going to take it through the U.S. and see the national parks.
So how old is he now? And how old is he when this happened?
Let's see, at the time he was 58, so roughly 5 years ago, so he's 63. Yeah, he was. Yeah, so he was so hypothermic because he's only my size and slimmer, so that water sucked away his body heat in no time.
And so you said that whole rescue operation for the helicopter, that was a 5-hour operation to...
Yeah, because they left in the dark and they got back about 11 a.m. So the men had been in the life raft for approximately 6 hours and being tossed out of it.
Do you know how close they came on their fuel?
That
Or how long can they last in that thing?
they were within about 10 minutes of what they call bingo time, where they leave no matter what, even if you have to leave a survivor in the water, because bingo means you're not going to make it to land. So thank God that hook hit Drew, because they were running out of options. And Drew didn't make any mistakes. He just ran out of gas. I mean, what happened was, he told me, he said when he fell off that big wave, he had swallowed so much seawater, he was in the process of vomiting, and now he's underwater, so even more came in, and he just could not get his breath. So he kept getting tumbled and rolled. And every now and then, they could see his neon helmet, and that saved his life. And Aaron's skill was amazing. Because they would say things like, normally Scott would calm the pilot and go, 5 feet to the right. I need you to go that way, because he's looking down at the rescue swimmer. And he said, if I said 5 feet to the right, he said the helicopter would shoot 20 feet because the wind, the slightest movement on the cyclic would just throw the helicopter way off course. Other questions or comments?
I'm surprised that there were photos of inside the helicopter. I would think,
I know.
how do they have time to do that?
But this is what Nevada was doing. He was making the key decisions and calling out the big waves, but he had a little handheld video camera, and while he's calling out the waves, he's going like this. And so most of his video is terrible. He shot maybe a half hour of video in the course of the 3 hours of the real bad seas, but every now and then one image was fairly clear and you saw it. So that's where he would put it behind the plane, into the cabin, and that's how he got that shot. And he got in trouble for that.
Mm-hmm.
And then I found out, this is strange coincidence, that just prior to this rescue, Nevada played the role of Lieutenant Krause in The Guardian. And then this rescue happens and he does the real thing. So he beat out all the other coasties for that plum
Right,
part
Kevin
in the
Costner.
movie. Yeah, the Kevin Costner movie. And then he's in his own real rescue. So he's like, I gotta play myself if they make this into a movie, you know? I don't wanna play anybody else. So he was key. Of all the people I interviewed, Nevada was the key. He was the most helpful, wanted to see this project through to beginning to end. Well, I hope you take a look at the books. I'd be happy to sign them as early Christmas gifts. And Diana, thank you for having me back.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. What did get you into writing